This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, where I'm very pleased to have a return engagement from Professor George Lees, who is a longtime student not only of issues that are commonly discussed on this show, but of the history and contributions of Greg Hallett, whom I have interviewed on this program many, many times, including from New Zealand, but also from locations in Europe, and where George and I are both relatively convinced that Greg has been taken out, where it would appear the most probable suspect is the Crown, no doubt using MI5 or MI6, because Craig has revealed so much about the illegitimacy of the present occupants of Buckingham Palace that they have undoubtedly been very disturbed by Greg's revelations, which even led to a change in the laws of succession to the crown because of his having exposed that the legitimate heir to the crown was actually alive and well and living in Spain. So, George, please do pick it up from there.
I believe it was Portugal.
Portugal, yes, right. Thank you.
Yeah. So I've made a video on your contribution and on Greg's life. He, I believe, was the world's most informed historian, and he was certainly one of the most courageous, because he had published, I think, up to 15 books over the course of 15 years or so on the ownership of the world and how crooked it is, and how it's run by criminal cabals, which effectively are like the mafias, with governments as entirely paid puppets, and we're in a really serious position now. And what I've discovered recently is that there is a nuclear weapons scandal running in the UK, and I've reported it in the form, I'm in divorce proceedings, but I've done nothing wrong in my entire life, and because my wife's in panic that her family use slightly fraudulent methods in money laundering, she got ever so panicky and she's now in divorce proceedings, but she's been rash enough to forward my bad behaviours, which are my investigations of massive war crimes and money laundering issues. And when I reported the fact, have you heard of Trident, Jim? That's the nuclear deterrent in the UK?
Yes.
Yeah, so the Trident project runs out of Glasgow, Clydeside. I think they've got 4 submarines heavily armed with nuclear warheads, and what my wife's solicitor has been doing is forwarding my behaviours formally as documents to the law courts in Jedburgh.
George, that's all very interesting and profoundly personal. I would like for you to tell us some of what it is you have exposed that the courts may or may not find impressive.
Well, they're already privy to Greg's exposure of the illegitimacy of the monarchy, and they have relayed that to me. All of my website and all of the index and all of the topics on my website, including 6 or 7 articles from Greg and the interviews that you've made with him and the interviews that Red Ice Radio made with him in Denmark, all of that is on air now, and all of it is up front under the scrutiny of the judges in Jedburgh. And what I've done in recent weeks is to top it up. Have you heard of Bernie Ecclestone?
The name is vaguely familiar, George. Tell us more.
He's a prominent funder for the Conservative Party in the UK, and he's a leader in the Formula 1 motor racing sector.
All right.
He was the man that, have you heard of the Great Train Robbery in the UK?
Yes.
So he was the one who funded Ronnie Biggs to flee to Brazil, and the whole thing was staged to cover up the Cold War issues and the spying scandals involving Christine Keeler.
Yes.
Sexual scandals.
Who was a very high-class call girl that was consorting with members of Parliament and other prominent figures in British society.
Absolutely. That's way back, I think, in the early 60s. And,
yes.
You know, the Great Train Robbery was a massive news diversion from that. And Biggs was given, I think it was a couple of million, to flee to Brazil, to have a high-profile sort of swinging lifestyle with scantily clad women on the beaches, and to completely take the attention off the Russian linkage and the spying things and the Cold War issues that are massive. That includes the cover-up of the renewable energy source that is oil. Greg taught me about that, and I've now found the documents on how oil is made deep within the Earth's core, and I've published that along with issues on the massive Gazprom scams in the European energy provision sector, and all of that links in to the pan-continental frauds that Gordon Bowden, John Patterson and I have revealed already. But what I've discovered is that the British press, and I know that the American press do the same thing, if they see something that is particularly sensitive for the government or the moneylenders that run the governments, they put in obfuscation headlines. And when I saw that Eccleston Square was a location in London for business registries, I thought, now these are relatively minor crimes. Ronnie Biggs committed no crime at all. Eccleston funds things like the selling off of Britain's gold, and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown benefiting from that. So when I look up the Eccleston Square registrations on the business registry, I find Trident 3 and Trident 4, and on the board of directors you have prominent media people, but you have got a person called Tim Spicer. Now, he has been a mercenary army leader in sub-Saharan Africa for 30 years. So that is the...
And I presume, George, you're in a position to prove all these things.
Yeah, we've got the corporate documents, and I sent some of them to you in an email. I think it was maybe 7 to 9 days ago.
Okay.
I can send it again if you wish.
No, just continue, just proceed.
And so
that was just a caveat in passing.
I'm really frustrated that I'm doing all of my investigative journalist as an amateur, because I'm one of the world's most innocent and informed people, and because of that I cannot get a job. I've been in the best university in New Zealand, and my department achieved a massive improvement in its research score, and we were the best in the medical school across 3 campuses. But when I started to talk about fraud involving Lord Sainsbury, the science minister in the UK, I got booted out of that university in New Zealand. And I've sent you my YouTube channel where I'm exposing things about the refusal to take on people to study Agent Orange and the defoliation program in Vietnam. Even
George,
although
what was your area of academic specialization?
I'm a neuroscientist and a toxicologist. So I got this Vietnamese student with a prestigious scholarship, and we could not get support from the university. And when I was booted out, that prestigious scholar was also booted out. He had to go to Auckland and downgrade his research efforts to a master's. But the most important things that I'm aware of in the world, and the chaotic governance of the world, is the loss of sovereignty in every one of the participant nations, and the loss of the capacity of those nations to issue their own democratic funding. And it's you and Greg that have exposed that for me. The running of the world by breeding bureaus and the takeover of the... Are you still there?
Oh yeah.
All right.
Right ahead. Continue.
The taking over of all of the European monarchies by the Rothschilds family, and the news that you and Greg got out, and on the changes in the laws of succession, it is ruthless, it's illegal, and I believe that Greg has been killed. I cannot see any other way around it. But you've not heard of him since your last interview, which was in 2012?
Oh, George, I'm convinced too that Greg has been taken out. I think it's absolutely terrible. And I suspect it has to do with his revelations about the crown more than anything else.
Absolutely, yeah. But everything that he told us was logical. It tallied with what was happening to the economy, where NATO were sweeping into, and the fact that those were the last central banks to be acquired by the cabal and the global mafias that now run the world and run the law courts in every country.
Yes. Well, I've not been in the position to vouch for or verify every claim that Craig was making. I have no doubt that he is the foremost revisionist historian of our time, George.
So I just wanted you to know that I'm involved in that case, and now I've been given a gagging order by the sheriff. Scotland's involved in a major set of changes in the way that it runs its police force. They've created a united force with one political powerhouse at the head of that. He's from the City of London, from the Metropolitan Police, like Lord Condom, who chaired Princess Diana's inquest, declared it to be a fatal accident in England. And you know about Greg's issues and his declaration that in France it was declared to be an unlawful killing, aka the official term for a killing in the royal family.
Yes, I have no doubt it was an unlawful killing. In fact, I have featured the leading expert on the death of Princess Diana on this very show, and it's tragic, but she appears to have been beaten to death in the ambulance that was purportedly taking her to the hospital, but in fact making sure that she would not survive the event.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've done a lot of research on you know, the people that were Princess Diana's enemies. She was very down on landmines, and the Bredenkamp people in the Republic of South Africa, which was declared by the Conservative Party and the Weapons Inspectorate to be nuclear free when they visited a place called Pelindaba. It was a complete stitch-up. They've been producing nuclear warheads and trading them with Israel, with various North African Arab countries, and all of that has been going on right under the noses of the government. And when they declared that the Republic of South Africa was nuclear free, they gave the delegations that went there to inspect the place ploughshares to pretend that everything was clean and legit.
As in transforming swords into plowshares.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely cynical. And if you've seen the Out of Africa movie, the inquest was led by a man called Blitzen, or Blitz, and in the Out of Africa movie, the man that got the syphilis had the same name, with the Germanic links to the head of the weapons delegation. And when they went into Syria this year, the head of the delegation was one of the World Bank executives. It is really twisted. But basically what I've done, and basically what the Scottish Government's response to me dropping out in neuroscience and becoming a fraud researcher, is that they have to change the composition of the law firms in the country and the composition of the makeup of the Scottish police. Now, this is in the year that we have had an independence referendum. The Scottish Nationalist Party has a massive majority in our Holyrood Parliament, and what they ran for was exactly the same thing as we currently have. And when I began to investigate law enforcement in Scotland, it was quite obvious that they put in false flag news items, and I've made videos on my YouTube channel. Is if you go to youtube.com and then /user /Kelsonian Smithsonian /videos, you'll see the titles. Now, there was a child murder in 1957, the year I was born, and the child's name was Moira Anderson, and they reopened the case the day that the head of the Scottish United Force, the policeman from the Metropolitan Police in London, he got his pay rise from 100k to 250,000. Same week he got his knighthood. Now the citizens get a little bit uppity when something like that happens, because in Britain the public sector pay has been frozen for 5 years back to back. Can you see the magnitude of that? The chief executive in every corporation gets a massive bung every year because of the criminality that we're reporting in the big four auditing firms and in the law enforcement firms that are appended to them.
And lest the point be lost, you mentioned the Scottish referendum. Can you imagine any Scotsman not voting for Scottish independence?
Yeah, they're ever so... You know how the medias are twisted, and effectively they're propagandists now. And no one, since Rupert Murdoch killed a chap called Sean Hoare in London, just before they opened the Leveson inquiry, he was the last, you know, free-spirited investigative journalist that worked for the News Corp empire. He was killed. It was portrayed as a suicide, and he was portrayed as a heavy drinker. It's a crock of shit. He was assassinated so that the rest of them live their lives in fear, and all they will write about is trivia. That's all we've got in the British press now. And I know it's the same in America, because I watch Fox News quite a lot on Murdoch's Sky Vents.
Well, George, just let me make the point more explicit, though I'm sure you share it. It's clear to me the referendum was manipulated using, you know, whatever techniques, that there's no way it would not have passed in Scotland, but that the Crown deposed it, and therefore they, you know, infiltrated the voting mechanism to guarantee a predetermined outcome.
So the law courts in Scotland are run by the Crown Office. Yeah. And when I declared for them, and you know, the SNP supporters became ever so aware of the potential of my news releases and all of my videos, and they began to approach me on street corners and at public meetings, and they said, you know, can you get on the podium and can we get this news out, because the news that the big criminals are in Westminster will bring them down. Now, I reported to Alex Salmond and a woman called Nicola Sturgeon, who was his deputy leader of the SNP, these massive crimes through the course of the last 18 months. And what they've done in response is to attack me as an independent, free-minded person, and everything that I've declared they've tried to cover up, including the running of a nuclear weapons profiteering scandal out of the City of London in the Westminster area, run by a mercenary army leader, and hosted in Eccleston Square, where there are other registrations involving BBC media magnates. It is that news alone, if it had been released in any form of free press or even in pamphlets from the SNP, would have shamed the Westminster government into defeat. Now, when Salmond was eventually defeated, or he abdicated for shame, he packed up within a day of the announcement. Even the rigging of the election it's everything now is a role play and a sideshow from the actual truth about how chaotic our world has become. And when you and Greg talked about the coercion in New Zealand, you talked about the coercion in America, you talked about bringing down the Twin Towers and the funding of that, and how that allowed them to sweep into the last remaining countries for their narcotics wealth, all of it makes sense. And the killing of Greg makes absolute sense for me, because they were so embarrassed by what he was declaring that the world's ownership was going to change hands. It was going to be reformed back to the ownership of the world by democracies rather than private money lenders. Yeah. You know the truth in that, and so do I, and now the Jedburgh Sheriff Court know it, so they've told me to shut the fuck up. I'm not allowed to talk to the people that are already privy to that information on the nuclear scandal. They've given me a gagging order and threatened to jail me. That's because I'm telling the truth about our country's sovereignty and the tyrannical ownership of it for 160 illegitimate years. So if you can get people focused on my YouTube channel, all of the news is pouring out, and if I get banged up, will you try and get a petition together to get me released?
Boy, George, I know all the truth tellers seem to suffer inequities of one degree or another, some more severe than others, but where Greg appears to me and to you to have paid the ultimate price. And it's a reflection of Orwell's observation that in a time of universal deceit, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act. It's completely unexpected, and the powers in control are going to do their best to suppress it by one means or another.
So the child murder was of a girl called Moira Anderson, and the new company that was created by the Scottish Government in Parliament Square in Edinburgh in the year of the referendum, when the SNP has that massive majority. You've got it right on the button. Scotland could only win its freedom unless there was corruption intertwined in the system. That corruption was introduced by the Scottish Government and the Speculative Society, which is SS, a secret society in the city of Edinburgh that has been running since the, I think it's about the middle of the 17th century. It is just twisted. And even in New Zealand, where I was in the best medical school. When we left, it was the best medical school. When I went out there, it was 4th in 7 medical schools in the listing, and it was still governed and accredited by Edinburgh University. The links to the British mafias are global, and you know that as well. You know all what Greg told us about the taxation in the USA, the handing over the ownership of the world now to Israel from 2012, and America's legacy from the Crown is that massive tax burden that Greg described, which I think went through to 2040. Was that correct?
Well, bear in mind, George, that I like to feature guests with diverse points of view, including Greg and you, but that I'm not therefore necessarily in the position to have verified or certified the claims you or he have made, though I find them quite fascinating and typically highly plausible.
So I made a video which I forwarded to you on the illegitimacy of the Crown, Christianity, and the con that is law enforcement in the UK. If the listeners would care to look for that on Kelsonian Smithsonian's channel, then they will get insight into the deeply insightful discussion that you had with Greg in the World of Truth interviews numbers 5 and 6.
Let me repeat that title for the benefit of our audience, George, before we have to take our first break. Illegitimacy of the Crown, Christianity, and the Con, C-O-N.
Yeah. That
is law enforcement. George, we're going to take our first break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest today, Professor George Lees, talking about a variety of issues of corruption, including in relation to the Crown, and the legacy of Greg Hallett, the leading revisionist historian of our time. We'll be right back. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, continuing my conversation with Professor George Lees. George, we agree that the Scottish referendum appears to have been stolen. This midterm election in the United States also appears to have been selectively stolen, where the techniques that are being used by the Republican Party are becoming more and more refined. My impression at this point in time is that they have moved from the state level to the county level, and that the manipulation that's taking place is increasingly subtle, but where, if you understand the big picture, the qualifications of the candidates and the development of the campaigns, it should have been obvious, for example, to offer one illustration I know up close and personal, that Mary Burke, who was running against Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin, ran a far superior campaign. The issues were virtually all on her side. Walker gave a perfunctory performance during the debates. Mary Burke was very strong. She had the support of very popular political figures here in the United States, including Michelle Obama twice, Bill Clinton, even Barack Obama himself. That there was a surge toward the end, but in favor of Mary Burke. Nevertheless, a poll was published by the Marquette Law School suggesting there had been a surge in favor of Scott Walker, which I challenged repeatedly in a discussion thread about this because it made no sense whatsoever. If there were going to be a surge, it would not have made any sense that it should be in favor of Scott Walker, who has been doing his best to turn Wisconsin into the into the Mississippi of the Midwest. He declined high-speed rail, would have brought $800 million in funding with it. He has defunded public education to a similar quantity. He broke up the public unions here in the state. He's been opposed to women's reproductive rights. He's even declared his personal position to be that a woman isn't entitled to abortion even in cases of rape or incest, or to save the life of the mother. He refused to take Medicaid funding from the government that has led to the consequence that the taxpayers of Wisconsin are going to have to shoulder a $100 million increased tax burden every 2 years. He has, facilitated mining in the northern part of the state, in return for which he received a $700,000 campaign donation. There have been issues involving his corrupt run for the office in the past, involving collusion between private organizations and his own, where thousands of emails have been found and disclosed. He had a history of bad press about this John Doe investigation. I mean, the idea that there should be a surge for Walker after the race having been nip and tuck, 47, 47, 47, 47, again and again and again, was simply absurd. And yet it's very clear now that the outcome, the result in the end, which gave him some 53% of the vote to a much smaller percentage for Mary Burke. If you were to reverse the numbers, George, if you're simply to reverse the numbers, then I think you'd have an approximate indication of what actually happened.
So it's a massive electoral fraud, like the Nixon issues and the issues that ensued with the Chad stuff and the Florida. I didn't even know there was an election. You've taken my breath away. I thought we were going to talk about religious fraud and the war crimes.
We talk about religious fraud as well, but what I'm pointing out, George, is not only is it apparent, I think, to any objective observer, that the Scottish referendum has to have been managed. And you well know, I'm sure, that the CIA has manipulated elections in many countries abroad, but now it's applying its techniques right here in the United States, which it, of course, has in the past been unable to do, at least not legally. But where there was a change in the Smith-Mudd Act of 1947, which prevented, by law, barred the CIA from using the same methods of propaganda and disinformation that it has used abroad in the United States, which was vitiated by the Defense Appropriations Act of 2013. So, now everywhere in the country we're all fair game for false reports and manipulation of
Absolutely. It's just the same with the Scottish referendum. I mean, basically, because you and I and Greg are doing what we're doing, they have panicked in a major way. And when I've got the proof that Christianity is a total stitch-up for 2,000 years, and I sent you an image there that was of the Garden of Eden, which is actually now called the Yemen. And it was carpet bombed for the BP plant in the Gulf of Aden in the 1960s. And you know the news that Greg told you about Prince Eddie, that impinged upon Shakespeare's writings, and all of that is twisted news reporting, and it's manipulated by the moneylenders that shag the monarchs, get the illegitimate children, and then take control of the bank that country runs. When that news comes out, then the world will change in a major way, because all of the news medias and all of the politicians are traitors to their countries. That's why they're in panic.
The problem being, George, how would it ever get out other than by limited venues such as this, when the media are massively controlled? I mean, really, as William Colby observed, the agency of which he was a former director, meaning the CIA, owns everyone of significance in the major media, which Carl Bernstein had in essence reported many years before he made that observation in an article published in Rolling Stone in 1977 entitled "The CIA and the Media," where high officials of the CIA were boasting that their greatest successes had been with Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS. And if anyone understood the American media at that period of time, if you control Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS, you virtually have a lock on the American media. So the problem is, number one, how will the information ever get out? And number two, how will the people be able to organize to do anything about it, especially when, number three, all the voting mechanisms are under control of the bad guys? I mean, to put it in a nutshell, and it's diabolically clever, because the only way, presumably, we could get rid of these electronic voting machines that are being used to steal election is through a legislative process. But since those who control the legislative process benefit from electronic voting machines, which will elect them again and again and again, they are not going to change their usage, even if their corruption were to be demonstrated 7 ways to Sunday. So we're in a dilemma here, George, and I'm becoming increasingly concerned that the attempts of the Republicans to dismantle the social welfare network introduced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which today includes not only Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, but unemployment insurance, workman's compensation, and the like. All of those are targets by these Republicans who don't want to spend a nickel on anyone else and to save it all for themselves, and if they can't destroy the programs outright, they want to privatize them. And it's all disgusting and completely undemocratic, un-American, putting profits ahead of democracy.
Yeah, I agree. But the reason I wanted to talk about religion is, I was a Catholic altar boy. I did not get abused by any of the priests. I got my morality from the Catholic Church, and I adhere to the rules, and I am now more God-fearing than ever. Because since I became an investigative journalist, and since I dropped out of the futile neuropharmacology sector, I've invented a couple of drugs, we've had a couple of patents filed, and I've saved a few patients from epileptic crises with the development of new pharmaceuticals. But when I look back on my career, I think, what a frickin' waste of time. And when I look at the state of the funding for every university across the globe now, what intelligent people need to do is just to come together like you and Greg did, and I have done with a few people that we're making Skype interviews with. We are eliciting now spates of resignations in the political sector. We are getting monarchs to abdicate, and when you see the images of those monarchs in the news, they have a stick in both hands and they can barely move one foot in front of the other. I know that God is alive and well, and I don't know what happened to God or the gods or how many there are or what their gender is, but for some reason they appeared in the 20th century to go to sleep now. But the number of media men that are having major cardiovascular accident for the deceit in their sector is something that I am bringing into the public eye. Have you heard of Lord Patton?
Tell us about
Lord Patton is the head of Oxford University. He used to be the governor of Hong Kong. He's the head of the BBC as well. He's a multi-trillionaire at the people's expense, and when I reported the explicit details of that in April, he had a major cardiovascular accident on the May the 17th. There has been no news of Lord Patton ever since, and that is one of the leaders of the biggest corporations on the globe. the number of people that have been media men and have died in the period of the Scottish referendum, the number of people in the media that you listen to at 6 o'clock at night that are getting cardiovascular accidents or have incurred cancer, I know that God is on our side, and I now believe firmly in the occult, and I think that the politicians believe firmly in the occult, and the families like the Rothschilds have relied on that for centuries to keep the world in its place and to run it crookedly. So there's an element of religion that I need to tell you how clever the religious fraud is, and how long.
Let me just say, George, just for the record, that I am a professional philosopher who has evaluated all of the arguments for the existence and for the non-existence of God, none of which are persuasive, leaving me as an agnostic, neither believing.
I don't believe in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is a fraud.
Nor believing that God does not exist, where I regard the wisest maxim to emerge from the religious texts, authors, speakers, priests, poets, ministers, rabbi: God helps those who help themselves. Meaning, in my opinion, that we can't count on the Almighty to do work that is up to us to get done. So I wish I could take solace in the belief that God is going to make things work out right, but I'm sorry to say that I simply lack
Can I
that
tell you the story about the defrauding that is the New Testament and the writing of that? The New Testament was written in Naples, or Herculaneum, which is a synonym for Naples, at the north of Italy. It was written in 79 AD in the Villa Papyri, and that year the Villa Papyri was buried by tons of lava. That's right underneath Vesuvius. I know there is a God, and I know that all of the acts of gods, the massive landslides, the tornadoes, the massive storms, if you look at human history and you tie those seismic events to what occurred that year in that place, then you know that there are I don't know how many gods there are, and I know that there are likely to be gods that rule the different elements, and I know that now. The things that have happened to me and colleagues who stand in my way, who I'm very interested in healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa, and when I tried to get people focused on the fact that we've had pharmacological treatments in childbirth that make childbirth really, really safe in the UK. The death rate for mothers in the UK is 1 patient in 180,000 people. If you look at the statistics in Liberia, where they have no inhalational anesthetics, all they've got is a drug called ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic. 1 in 12 mums dies in childbirth. It's because we cannot share with them what we've had for 200 years already. And Greg explained where the narcotics go. Instead of the opium going into the ITU or the birth centre in the county hospital in sub-Saharan Africa, it ends up in New York or the Golden Triangle to dismember US troops when they're there. And when I tried to get the academics to convene a meeting on that crisis there, what they tried to do was to invent new drugs for those African countries in an entrepreneurial sense. And the colleague that did that was in the ITU. He's now had his colon removed. And it was quite stunning. He wrote an email to me within hours he was in the ITU, and the number of events that have occurred like that in my local churches, in the local surgeries, the people that I work with, if they get obstructive, they get taken down. And I would never have believed it. I'm an objective scientist, and I would never have declared it. But now the people around me know it, and I believe now that the reason I believe in the occult is I believe I've taken on the status of what they would have called a wizard in the Lord of the Rings movie. What you said about human people taking the initiative and taking the moral stand, I now know that if you've got the courage to stand up and declare that Lord Patton is a criminal and that he's stealing £50,000 from all English students for a 4 years honours degree that he got for nothing, then he's been disappeared by the news media. That
what you're talking about there is that the education college used to be for free in New Zealand in particular, but now they charge tuition.
No, I'm back in the UK now.
Yeah.
So Lord Patton is the head of the BBC in England. He's the head of Oxford University.
And Oxford, yes.
Yeah, he's the head of
Oxford. Was an Oxford education ever free and open to the public?
Yeah, in 1995, everybody in the UK got their tertiary education free, completely free, at the state's expense.
But not necessarily at Oxford, of course.
Yeah, everybody. It's a public funded initiative. In America,
what I mean is we're not having not all UK students are going to Oxford. They're going to many different institutions, right? But you're saying that there was
no, the whole of every university and college in England now charges £9,000 per academic year.
But it was in the past tuition free.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's fascinating.
And you got your local councils and your local government gave you funds for your subsistence expenses. I went all the way to professor without ever taking a loan, without ever being in debt. I owned my first car as soon as I got my driving license when I was 19. I had put the money together in my savings as a milk boy and a paper round deliverer.
George, we're going to be dividing our conversation into two parts. For right now today, I want to know, when you talk about religious fraud, you're talking about misrepresentations of claims in religious texts or their interpretation?
Jesus Christ never lived. It's a total stitch-up. All of it is academically documented. It's encoded numerically. You know how Alfred Hitchcock used to appear in his movies? There's a numerical Pythagorean code in the Christian Bible that declares the authorship of the Christian Bible. The man that discovered that was called Abelard Reuchlin, and his offices and his publishing units are in Washington on the west coast of America, just below the Canadian border. Have you heard of a place called Kent in Washington?
No, not offhand, but I have a son who resides in Seattle.
Well, he may well have been taken down as well, because when you look on Google Maps for the office that releases his PDFs now, what you find is the headquarters for T-Mobile, the mobile phone company, and part of the religious fraud is the laugh that the Christian cross is the letter T. So T-Mobile is a joke at the crucifixion of Jesus' expense. The whole Bible is like that, and all the news media and all the elites who can speak Latin and can read and write, only the elites can read and write up to 1913. That's when we introduced education, and that is when this system began to fall apart, because the whole world now can use Google Translate to translate.
But George, there are, American public school texts for 8th grade students from like 1825 that represent, in my judgment, a higher standard than junior high school students or even high school students are expected to attain today in the United States. In other words, we've had a tremendous weakening of educational standards, which in the past, including in the 19th century, were very, very demanding compared to what they are today in the 21st.
Again, it was Greg that introduced me to how the world was still enslaved right up to World War I. And some of the articles that he has written about that, and I know even have you heard of indentured labour, and where people get hired for a year at a time? And have you seen the...
Well, it's a form of slavery. I mean, you know, many companies would run company stores, and they'd pay their workers like miners, you know, very low wages, demand they said they purchase everything they lived on through the company store, and treat them basically as hired slaves.
I was thinking more of the aristocracy. Have you read any of P.G. Woodhouse's work?
I have not, George. Go with it.
Well, he was... I don't know, I think he was alleged to be a pacifist, but you know, he's a very well-off man, and he lives in the elites in New York, and he interlocks with the elites in England. And what you've got is an upstairs downstairs scenario where the slaves live downstairs in the basement and the aristocracy live upstairs, and it is terribly harsh if you're downstairs. And a lot of the films that are made portray the gulf between the aristocracy and the people that work in their households. And Greg's talked about the maid who's sired by the man upstairs, or the monarch, and it's the maid that eventually becomes the Queen Mother. In the case of the current regime, where the Queen Mother was the maid because the man that made the King's speech was an imbecile with an IQ of 70 or such. You remember that story?
I actually never saw the film, but it was much acclaimed for whatever reason.
Well, I mean, things are really harsh if you're an employee in that sector, right up to 1914, and it's Greg's writings that emphasise that for me. And you know, in popular culture, the concept that the rich and poor intertwine now, it actually happened with that change in the laws of succession, because Commoner Kate had to be dug out of the prostitution sector really quickly so that they could retain the monarchy without the fuss. So it's Greg, and we've got a thing in the UK called the Poor House. Have you ever heard of that?
The poorhouse, sure.
Yeah. So when you were interned in a poor house, you were separated from your kids, and the kids would get abused. The parents could not know about that, and the poor house was run as a prominent institution all across the UK right up to the First World War. It's a life in slavery, and you're under a roof, but it is not a decent life at all. It is really horrific, and that stopped in 1914, and we began to give people education, even in rural areas in England and Scotland and all over the UK at that time, and that changed the world, and we're now in a position to communicate with educated people in every sector of life.
George, I look forward to our continuing our conversation. Your recent video study, Illegitimacy of the Crown Christianity and the Con, that is law enforcement, can be found on YouTube. I encourage everyone to do that. This is Jim Fetzer thanking my special guest for this hour, George Lees, for being here, and all of you for listening. Great work, George.
Are we still on air?
No, we're off now.
Okay, because what I've learned about the Garden of Eden is shocking, and it's a joke. Everything that they laugh at confirms the truth of my research. And when you see have I explained to you in previous interviews the war crimes jokes?
The war crimes jokes?
Yeah. Do you know who Mr. Bean was? The man who opened...
I'm not sure I do.
The man who opened the London Olympics in 2012 was an actor called... he's called Blackadder on the BBC comedies that he makes.
Okay.
But the real Mr. Bean is the war correspondent for Galipolli, and the Governor General in Australia, who laughed at that joke, has resigned within 6 weeks of me publicising that. It is shameful. You know about the Woodrow Wilson being involved in a sexual scandal I forget, was he Princeton?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was involved in a sexual scandal. What happened was that Untermeyer and Brandeis were appointed to the Supreme Court in America, and they coerced him into entering World War I and extending the course of World War I by 2 genocidal years. All of that is on my website, and all of it is underpinned by human evil. But when I learned that Winston Churchill culled, you know, the stuff that Greg told us about, there were no accidents, there were no really botched campaigns. All of it is a premeditated cull of the poor people who are conscripted into the war. And when the Anzacs, because I worked in New Zealand for 6 years, I'm in touch with their British Legion equivalent. And when the Governor General learns that the whole world understands that the opening ceremony of the Global Olympics in 2012 was a laugh at the Anzac war dead, she's resigned within 6 weeks. It is vicious. The BBC make comedies about people coming out of the trenches. This is our War Memorial Day today. Everybody's wearing poppies. The poppy joke, you remember George Bush's dad was called George Poppy Bush?
Poppy.
Yeah.
Poppy, P-O-P-P.
George Herbert Bush's nickname is George Poppy Bush.
Yes.
It's a joke about the poppies that are the Flanders Field icon for the war dead, and it goes all the way back to the defrauding and the writing of
I think its origin has to do with the opium trade, and that it refers to poppies as in Vietnam, Afghanistan.
No, Poppaea was Nero's wife in the Jewish Roman sector that invented the New Testament. The elites know that for 2,000 years, which is why the Bushes laugh at it. If they laugh at it, and they laugh at it on the BBC comedies, you know it is true. I've got all the research has been done by Jewish scholars, and you know, all of the cults are documented through all of that 2,000 year period. Every religious martyrdom, every cause, anti-Semitic. The Rothschilds are really clever. They did not opt for Christianity because the majority of people had done that already. They lived in a place called, they lived just to the east of the Black Sea, which is now Ukraine. You know, that's why they're in Ukraine still, covering up the brutal facts about how they've run the world from there for the whole of that time that Greg told you about. The last place to go in that sector was a place called Kievan, which is up to the north of the European continent, and that's why Hollywood made the film What Are We Going to Do About Kevin, who's psychiatrically unhinged. It's all a joke at the war dead's expense, and it all ties into the secrets of the religious frauds that are written about messianic figureheads by human beings, and the Jehovah's run their current news vent out of New York. It's ever so recent. But when I tell you about the Garden of Eden being in the Yemen, and what the Google are we on air yet?
No, we're not on the air. We're off.
So I don't know whether we can get all of this into one program, but I'm desperately keen to get it out quickly before I get what Greg got.
No,
and I believe that I know so much now that my son went to sub-Saharan Africa with one of the Queen's equerries in a fundraising campaign that steals from British kids. They dedicate 2 summers to raise the funds to run a corrupted charity in sub-Saharan Africa. Nothing ever changes for the poor people in the jungle. And you know, the stuff that Lyndon B. LaRouche has revealed about the scams and the land grabs in Africa are compelling for me. I totally believe it. Prince Philip's in charge of that, like the narcotics running. The whole thing is evil, but the royals understand that there never was a Jesus Christ, and the Queen Elizabeth II, the daughter of the maid and Winston Churchill, is God's senior representative in the Church of England in the UK. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was a former oil executive, and his mum was Winston Churchill's private secretary. It's all a stitch up. The religion, the law enforcement, the war crimes, everything is entirely for profit. And when you're clever like the Rothschilds and you opt to be Jews rather than Christians, then you've got the anti-Semitism tool. Everything you do, every war crime you commit, is done with impunity.
I can't do more today, but I look forward to our next conversation.
We've still got another half hour left, have we? Shall I introduce you now to the authors of the New Testament and where you can find the references to that?
George, that just gets into such, obscure issues that I'm not sure that would be of great interest to my audience.
Well, it's not obscure because it tells you about the ownership of the world, and it reveals for you instantly how old this is and how many people in America already know it. All of your mainstream media men know it, because when we reveal something about it, they panic and they cover it up. The author of the New Testament, one of the authors of the first few chapters, was Calpurnius Piso. That's, the initials are KP, and it means that,
George, I'll tell you, there's circumstances here you're not aware of. I have to undergo surgery in 2 days.
Oh la.
And things have come up here about the election and so forth, so that I can't do the 2 hours tomorrow. I'll do the 1 hour we've done. Will be broadcast tomorrow.
Right.
But I want to delay, our taping more until the future, if that's okay with you.
Okay. I've made some videos on it, but they're not really. I mean,
well, why don't you send me some links to some of your videos, okay?
I'll send you some links to my web pages. As an academic, you would be enthralled by it. It is really clever. It involves quite advanced mathematics. The numerical code is complex. It's much more complex than the Freemasonic numerical code that Greg refers to occasionally. Things like the letter 8 meaning something that is perpetual, and the letter 13 meaning the transition into the political sector.
George, thank you so much for today, George. I'll get back to you about the future.
Okay. They have not gagged you on this, have they?
No.
Do you operate at your own home, like?
Yeah, sure, yes.
Alright. Because it is stunning. If you visit my website and you look up Mr. Bean on my website and learn about the cull.
Thank you, George.
They took over the Gallipoli massacre was so that the Rothschilds, led by Churchill, could take over the oil wealth on the Russian steppes, and the genocide in that case was the Armenian genocide. This is why the news media are jumpy and why they're reporting only electoral fraud. And if we don't get it out together, then the risks for individuals working in this sector are massive. That's why I want to get it out and get it published as quickly as I possibly can. And I've made a little video about this, so my plea to you will be on air, and my revelations about the gravity of what they've done, the resignation of the Governor-General in Australia, about the war crimes that were turned into a joke at the opening ceremony of the London Olympics. That's going to come out tomorrow morning. Have you got any objections to that? Because, and for my own safety.
No, I mean, what do you mean? Stuff I've already recorded with Greg?
No, I'm recording it on my little camera here. And I've got, since we started to talk about the religious fraud, and the magnitude of it, and turning it into jokes at the war dead's expense. This is our War Memorial Day. The Queen's been at the cenotaph today with tears in her eyes, laughing at the profiteering. The Poppy Fund is run by Prince Philip for several decades, and the British Legions are run by Britain's richest man, the Duke of Westminster. It is a stitch up. The troops are culled.
Sorry.
Is that?
I just can't do more today. Okay.
Okay.
Good luck with everything.
So when is your operation?
Tuesday.
Okay. God bless. Best of luck with that.
Thanks, George. Thanks so much, my friend.
Okay. Cheers, Jim.
Cheers to you too.
Bye.